en route to the desert, could not bring himself to abandon, to the precious volume through the pages of which Lupus of Ferriere imagined himself to wander to and fro, to the neglected tomes hunted out of monastic libraries by Petrarch and later humanists, to the first and second classical texts off the newly invented printing press, both by Cicero, to the Ciceronian works that were among the first Latin texts available on the internet. Perhaps because this final category has given us a sense, likely false, that the materiality of reading is slipping away from us, recent years have seen a flurry of interest in the history of the book as an object, and in the history of reading as a practice that is not only intellectual, but also material. We have the lights back on. That's okay. But the material history of a literary work properly begins before the work ever became a book. In our own day, we often say that authors write books, but in point of fact, they almost never do. Authors scribble out drafts, type manuscripts, even submit word process documents to their publishers, but the book, stricto sensu, is almost always someone else's business. And although in the Middle Ages, scribe and author occasionally were the same person, throughout most of Western history, the material world of literary creation has been not so much the book as that which precedes the book. From this rather obvious point, let us return not to Cicero's bookish tomb, but to a moment some 8 years before his murder, and to a place somewhat farther down the coast, where Cicero had a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. One day in May 54, Cicero wrote a letter to his brother Quintus. I've been keeping myself reasonably comfortable and entertained, despite your absence, in my villas at Cumae and Pompeii, and I plan to stay put until June 1st. I've been writing that political text I told you about, a work packed full of difficulties. If it turns out as I want, the time will have been well spent. But if not, I'll throw it into the very sea I look at while I write, and I'll move on to something else, since I can't sit still and do nothing. Cicero's draft stayed dry, but the project underwent numerous changes before its completion years later. Indeed, we know an exceptionally great deal about the protracted genesis of Cicero's De Republica. The work had been conceived as a Latin counterpart to Greek philosophical writings on ideal government, most notably Plato's Republic. Cicero prefers to imagine his treatise as a logical consequence of his rise a decade earlier to Rome's highest elected office, but it was surely just as much a salve for the still open wounds of his subsequent exile. The work, however, was to be a product not only of first-hand experience, but also of research. Around the time that Cicero wrote the letter to Quintus just quoted, he sent an urgent request to his friend Atticus, away as often in Greece. Please write to your home in Rome with instructions that your books should be at my disposal no less than if you were there, all of them, including Varro's. I need to get a few things out of those books for use for those which I have in my hands, which I hope will meet with your enthusiastic approval. Atticus's library was a resource of special value, but interesting collections could also be found in the country. Exactly a year before, in a friend's Campanian villa, Cicero had consulted what may have been the remnants of the library of Aristotle itself. Following his Platonic model, Cicero decided to set his treatise in dialogue form, but in the interest of political discretion, he thought it best not to make himself and his contemporaries the speakers. Instead, Cicero would place his invented dialogue in the mouths of luminaries who had lived nearly a century before, the members of the so-called Scipionic Circle, who had presided over a kind of political and literary golden age. Originally, Cicero planned for the dialogue to have 4 speakers, and to be divided into 9 books, each comprising a day of discussion. By July, he had added 6 more participants, and had decided to affix to each book a prologue in his own voice. Around this time, Atticus wrote to suggest that Cicero give their friend Varro, the one whose book Cicero wanted, a role in the dialogue. Cicero objected that Varro could not possibly participate in a dialogue set in past, but promised to look for him a place in a prologue, since not to found one. By fall, Cicero had completed 2 books, but when he had them read to himself and a friend, the friend observed that the arguments would have greater auctoritas if given in Cicero's own name, rather than in the pretended words of man long dead. This prompted an abrupt change of course, and Cicero decided to frame the whole dialogue as a brotherly chat between himself and Quintus. Then the record falls silent for several years, and the De Republica does not resurface again until 51, when Cicero remarks in a letter that Atticus has been reading through the work. It is not known whether Atticus made use of the red crayons he later used to mark corrigenda in Cicero's drafts. In 50, Cicero and Atticus decided to proceed with publication. That is, Atticus had his staff of scribes make copies for distribution within his and Cicero's circles of influence, whence further copies would be disseminated. In April, Atticus noticed a spelling error in a Greek name, and Cicero wrote instructing him to fix the mistake in his exemplars. The only surviving copy of the text, the famous Vatican palimpsest, retains the error, and so presumably descends from one of the initial copies made by Atticus' scribes before the mistake was caused. The De Republica met with rapid success, and it remained widely influential until it was lost in the early Middle Ages, not to be found again until 1819, when Angelo Mai, prefect of the Vatican Library, peered through a copy of St. Augustine's Commentary on the Psalms, to which he had applied chemical reagents, and found a palimpsest copy of a third of the lost Ciceronian work, staring back. But long before the De Republica was lost, Cicero sat in his villa with a view, wondering whether such a book was a good idea. I want now to focus on that moment and to ask of it a question that may at first seem strange. And Cicero stared out at the sea. Was he alone? I do not mean primarily to ask whether or not Cicero was lonely. Cicero seems always to have been at least a little lonely, not least because, as a social climber, he never won full acceptance from Rome's arrogant elite. I mean my question first and foremost in its most literal sense. Was anyone else in the room with Cicero? If the valet in question was, as seems likely, Cicero's cumanum, which had a large staff, then a servant might have slipped in from time to time to bring refreshment. But what I really want to know is whether Cicero kept at his side a scribe, perhaps his trusted secretary, Cicero. In other words, did Cicero dictate the text he composed that day, both the letter to Quintus and whatever progress he made on his nascent political treatise, or did he write them down himself, in his own hand? The Romans made extensive use of slaves trained as scribes. Dictation, especially of letters, was considered a crucial convenience for the active Roman, whose public and private correspondence might occupy a considerable portion of his daily routine. But certain situations required a letter in the hand of its sender, and autograph letters seem to have been the rule among close intimates. Later that same summer, Cicero began a letter to Quintus from Rome with an apology for occasionally needing to resort to dictation, explaining that he has been overwhelmed by responsibilities, to say nothing of the oppressive Roman heat. Similar apologies now and then in other letters to Quintus are the exceptions that prove the rule. And so we may be fairly sure that when Cicero decided to tell his brother what he's been doing with his spare time on the Campanian coast, he pushed Silas to wax tablet himself. The matter of literary composition is more difficult. Roman poets refer on occasion to their own tablets and even to their own corrections and erasures, suggesting that as a rule they themselves first gave physical shape to their poems. Indeed, shape may be just the right word, for Roman authors like to refer to the finishing of a literary work as its polishing with a lima, file, the tool used by sculptors to smooth the surface of stone. The image of the poet engaged in a hands-on struggle with a blank page is one to which the modern period has long been accustomed. But its relevance for antiquity may surprise those who think of ancient poetry as the spontaneous songs of inspired bards. Poetry was indeed performed publicly by professional reciters, and even in private, ancient readers may have preferred to read aloud. But by Roman times, not only the circulation of poetry, but, more importantly for our purposes, even its creation, was unthinkable without writing. A humorous scene helps us to understand why. In an episode of Petronius' Satyricon, a droning sound from the hull of a sinking ship turns out to be the two-bit poet Eumolpus, reciting aloud as he composes a new masterpiece on a huge piece of parchment, oblivious to the impending disaster. The Roman poet was nominally a bard, but though he might imagine himself conversing with an invented character, or invoking the muse, or addressing a future audience, nevertheless, at the moment of composition, he was only talking to himself, which in practice meant that he was talking to the page, whether parchment, papyrus, or wax. This sort of dialogue becomes explicit in a remarkable passage in the little red poet Persius, who died young in the age of Nero, leaving behind a short book of extremely complex satirical verse. In one and so on. A book makes its way into my hand in parchment, left two-toned by the removal of its coat, and sheets of papyrus and a knotted deep pen. Then I complain because the liquid hangs from the nib, but adding water makes the black ink disappear. And I complain because diluted drops fall double. Oh, you pathetic creature, more pathetic every day. Has my life really come to this? Persius here offers our most vivid description of an ancient poet at work on a draft, and the only surviving instance of an ancient writer addressing his pen. What makes this especially remarkable is its possible connection to a problem that has plagued readers of Persius for ages. Persius' poems are conversations, but unlike similar poems by others, his poems cannot be resolved into simple dialogues between two or maybe three speakers. This does not stop readers from stubbornly trying, but evil scribes attempted to divide the poems between, for example, a monitor and an auditor, and editors and translators ever since have tried similar devices, seldom agreeing with each other not only regarding the identities of the speakers, poet and friend, philosopher and student, but even on where one part ends and another begins. The truth is that Persius often conjures interlocutors only to abandon them almost immediately. At one point, he even begins to answer words of self-reproach placed in the mouth of an unnamed speaker by saying, "Whoever you are whom I just made to speak from the other side." Persius begins another poem with a line that we might be able to take as the key to his poetics. It is customary for bards to require for themselves 100 voices. Persius's provisional speakers who seem to come from nowhere are part of a dizzying but deliberate schizophrenia. The poet does not merely talk to himself, he talks to himself, and this leads him to address not only the page, but the page in all of its manifestations, a book, a parchment, sheets of papyrus, and even the pen and its drops of ink, which multiply too quickly to control. But what has this to do with Cicero? Certainly no one to my knowledge has compared the great orator with a later tortured poet. In most respects, they could not be less alike. But what satirical poets and Cicero have in common is their interest in dialogic form. And what the De Republica and Persius' poems share is their unrestrained proliferation of interlocutors, 9 in the final version of Cicero's treatise, and they're all shown on your handout, which reproduces the frontispiece to the first edition of the De Republica, published shortly after its discovery in 1819. Of course, Cicero's own voice is to be heard in that of his principal speaker, Scipio, shown in the middle of the picture. whereas the authentic voice of Perseus is more elusive. But this only means that Perseus was more daring. The basic mechanism is the same. Indeed, multiplicity seems to be the controlling theme of the De Republica, even at its most basic structural level. The work, as we've seen, originally was planned as 9 books, divided over 9 days, and eventually was written in 6 books, 2 for each of 3 days. It is interesting that, in the middle of this shift, Cicero considered reworking the treatise's complex conversations into a simple dialogue between himself as himself and an alter ego in the form of his brother. Perhaps an unconscious echo of this survives in the subject that opens the first day's discussion, the recent sighting of 2 suns in the Roman sky, interpreted as an ominous sign that Rome increasingly was divided against itself. If you look carefully, you can see one very evident sun and one very faint and skeptically portrayed sun in the clouds. This, of course, was grist for Cicero's ideological mill, since he was above all a prophet of political concordia. But there is also a more basic literary discord at stake here. For all literary creation begins with an encounter between the author and his or herself, even if only at that basic level referred to as self-reflection. Rome divided against itself is thus a model of the author's own internal dialogue, remarkably apt in this case, since Cicero's own conflicted identities mapped many of Rome's social divisions. Cicero's 2 sons are thus oddly like the 2 drops of ink from Perseus's pen, metaphors for the author's divided self, scene of the struggle against the voice that has just begun. And of course, if the fragmentation of the author is that which enables writing to begin, then it simultaneously is that which the text must somehow stitch together. But if not, I'll throw it into the very sea I look at while I write. Cicero describes his emerging project to his brother not merely as an idea, but as an object he might discard. Just as in a letter to Atticus, written perhaps on the same day, he refers to the work as that which I, quote, am holding in my hands, unquote. A rough draft was more than just a plan. It was part of the physical engine of poetic voice. On balance, it seems likely that Cicero first drafted the De Republica the same way Perseus drafted his poems, the same way Cicero himself wrote a letter to his brother, in his own hand. Just as he stared out at the sea, Cicero stared down at line upon line of his own thoughts, objectified into the words on the page. Writing was, and it is, a material process, and it is in this basic respect no different from the other arts. Of course, a painting, for example, incorporates actual bits and pieces of the artist's studio, canvas, pigments, resins, and so on, whereas it is the nature of literary circulation to offer us, in the book, no actual physical artifact of the writer's world, but only a kind of shadow of it. No doubt this is in part why so many lovers of literature are passionate bibliophiles. A book that can be appreciated as an object, even if not material in the same way, at least pays homage to the material world of the writer. But perhaps a more faithful echo of that original materiality may be found in 100 voices, to borrow Perseus' phrase, which trace the delicate fissures of the author's own dividing self. That beautiful cataclysm, first set in motion by the material encounter of poetic page. Thank you.
Just like to say good morning, colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. Obviously, so many colleagues and friends here. It's difficult to begin, but we will begin. I'm Elizabeth Crocker, Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in Visual Arts here at the National Gallery of Art. And on behalf of the trustees of the National Gallery, I want to welcome all of you here today for the first session in this symposium dedicated to the question of creativity and sketch. I'm going to leave it to the organizers, Hank Dillon and Irving Laban, to lay out their design for this concerto. It's very interesting for us here at the Gallery that concerto of Pensiero is an idea that Salvatore Settis began to lay out for us quite coincidentally last Sunday in his first Vellum lecture. But I want to thank Hank Dillon and Irving Laban very, very much for putting this very ambitious and exciting program together. And I should also thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the J. Stuart Johnson Senior Charitable Trust, and Mrs. F. Merle Smith for their support for this symposium here and at Princeton. And I want to give a special welcome to our friends from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton who are co-sponsoring this event. We've had joint lectures before here at the Center, but I think this symposium is special in terms of its complexity, including 2 venues and the materials being presented through various different media. The National Gallery in Canada have inherited a remarkable legacy from Hank Dillon, about which I learn more every single day I'm here. But perhaps the most remarkable in terms of events such as this is the spirit of cooperation and absolute can-do attitude among the staff of the Center. And the spirit of teamwork here is such that I even hesitate to single anyone out for special thanks. But I would be very sorry indeed not to thank Associate Dean Teresa O'Malley for all of her work in planning this event, and especially Kimberly Rodefo, who's probably outside the door rather than here, for her persistence and good humor over the past months as assistant to the program of scholarly meetings here at the Center. We have a couple of revisions just to notice in the program. Carlo Ossola from the Collège de France could not be present to deliver his paper, but we have a translated version of his paper available to you, I think, on the table outside. Anybody wants to pick that up. Unfortunately, Enrico Castelnuovo was also unable to come, and we've taken the opportunity of the space left for his paper this afternoon to ask Peter Partial of the National Gallery to come and talk briefly about the really wonderful exhibition which is just being installed at the moment on the unfinished print, and it's actually a rather nice connection with this program in terms of its theme. I will tell you that all of you who are registered in the symposium are entitled to a 20% discount in the gallery shop today, so that is an extra bonus for being here. And remind you that the symposium continues on Thursday and Friday at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and if you need a map or any directions for getting there, we also have those available to you outside. But the day is now here when I think we will all think about the sketch together, and I want to turn over the podium to Hank Miller to introduce the first session of the program.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's really a pleasure to be here at this podium. During this process were always and everywhere evident and deeply appreciated. As you may have read on the final fold of today's program, the evidence available seems to indicate that the use of drawings as a preliminary stage in the planning of a painting, a sculpture, or architecture may not have